You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Today at T-Mobile, I'm joined by a special co-anchor.
What up, everybody? It's your boy, Big Snoop Deal Double G.
Snoop, where can people go to find great deals?
Head to T-Mobile.com and get 4 iPhone 16s with Apple Intelligence on us, plus 4 lines for $25.
That's quite a deal, Snoop. And when you switch to T-Mobile, you can save versus the other big guys' comparable plans plus streaming.
Respect. We up out of here.
See how you can save on wireless and streaming versus the other big guys at T-Mobile.com/switch. Apple Intelligence requires iOS 18.1 or later.
Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to episode 487 of our Civil War podcast. My name is Rich.
And I'm Tracy. Hello, y'all. Welcome to the podcast. In his final official report, submitted after the end of hostilities, Ulysses S. Grant claimed that early in the Civil War, he became convinced that there was only one way to defeat the Confederacy. First, by using, quote, the greatest number of troops practicable against the armed force of the enemy.
And then by hammering the rebel armies and resources, quote, until by mere attrition, if no other way, there should be nothing left to him but submission. Although Grant made his report with the full benefit of hindsight, there's no reason to suppose that this passage misstates his strategy for 1864 after his rise to General-in-Chief of the Union armies. It certainly squares with the way he organized the federal effort in Virginia that spring.
By May 5th, 1864, no fewer than 165,000 federal soldiers menaced Virginia. Grant and Meade had 122,000 men in the wilderness. Meanwhile, southeast of Richmond, Major General Benjamin Butler, with 27,000 more, steamed up the James River toward Bermuda Hundred.
6,000 troops under Major General Franz Sigel had begun a march up the Shenandoah Valley, while another 8,500 under Brigadier Generals George Crook and William Averill forged across the Allegheny Mountains toward targets in western Virginia.
To meet this threat, the Confederates could muster only about 90,000 troops of their own, and some of those would have to be transferred from the Carolinas.
Given the Federals' preponderance of strength, it seemed that Grant's coordinated offensives in Virginia could scarcely fail to cripple the rebel war effort. Yet, in less than 2 weeks, the whole affair was a shambles. Every subsidiary offensive had been turned back or defeated, and reinforcements were being rushed to Lee's Army of Northern Virginia from Tidewater and mountain country alike.
How had Grant's peripheral strategy collapsed so spectacularly? Well, the long and the short of it is that with the exception of Grant and Phil Sheridan, the Federal commanders feared the Confederates more than the Confederates feared the Federals.
Time and again, Union forces advanced with caution, took ominous rumors at face value, and failed to take advantage of formidable numerical advantages. As a result, the Confederates managed the one thing that Grant explicitly sought to prevent, that is, the reinforcement of Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia.
However, for nearly 3 weeks, it wasn't at all obvious that Grant's peripheral strategy was destined to fail. These subsidiary offensives collapsed at different times, in different ways, for different reasons, and they were by no means totally lacking success.
The interdependent expeditions of Crook and Averill are a case in point. Grant originally intended these expeditions to be a single big raid led by Major General Edward O.C. Ord, who was a trusted protege of Grant's and had been one of his corps commanders during the Vicksburg campaign. Grant's instructions to Ord offer a window into Grant's hopes for the proposed campaign. Ord was to assemble about 10,000 men at Beverly, West Virginia, then strike southward and wreck the Virginia and Tennessee Railroad so thoroughly, quote, that it can be of no further use to the enemy during the rebellion.
Ord should also destroy whatever other Confederate war resources he could lay his hands on. Then, once joined by a separate force under George Crook that would attack the rebel salt works at Saltville, Ord would, if practicable, march northeast to Lynchburg, an important industrial center in central Virginia.
If things went extremely well, Ord would go still further, marching through the Piedmont, living off the land, and ultimately, quote, establishing a supply base on the James River, end quote. In other words, Grant envisioned a grand raid progressing from mountain highlands to tidal flats.
However, nothing like that transpired for the simple reason that the commander of the Federal's Department of West Virginia refused to cooperate.
That commander's name was Franz Sigel, a 39-year-old German expatriate, failed revolutionary, and darling of the German-American community. Because of Sigel's pull with the German-American community, Abraham Lincoln made him a political general. Sigel then proceeded to cultivate a permanent sense of grievance against the Anglo-dominated Federal High Command that he perceived as having so often slighted him. For example, by once giving him command of the smallest corps in the Army of the Potomac. This, Sigel had complained in early 1863, was quote-unquote exceedingly unpleasant, and he had asked to be relieved of duty.
Sigel got his wish with a vengeance. Not only was he removed from command, but Henry Halleck, who detested Sigel, left him awaiting new orders from March 1863 through the beginning of 1864.
Franz Sigel got out of the doghouse because of his political connections and his steadfast support of Abraham Lincoln. On February 29, 1864, Lincoln told Secretary of War Edwin Stanton to put Sigel in charge of the Department of West Virginia. A staff officer stationed in the department stated the case exactly when he wrote in his diary, quote, Halleck, they say, is indignant, but the Dutch vote must be secured at all hazards for the government, and the sacrifice of West Virginia is a small matter.
Grant, though, had no intention of simply writing off West Virginia. Political General Sigel may be in command of the department, but Grant intended the actual fighting would be left in the hands of Ord and Crook, who were competent professional soldiers.
When Grant's wishes were made clear to Sigel, he complained, no doubt accurately, quote, all dispositions are made in such a manner as if I did not exist at all. Well, Sigel took his frustrations out on Ord in particular, so much so that on April 19th, Ord asked to be reassigned. Sigel had slashed the number of troops in Ord's command, and Ord had no confidence that Sigel would keep even those men adequately supplied during the proposed expedition.
In the end, Ord's wish to get away from Sigel was granted, and as a result, the Beverly Raid, which Grant had envisioned as one big, far-ranging operation, instead devolved into 3 smaller expeditions.
The first, involving Crook and 6,000 men, was to strike at the Virginia and Tennessee Railroad near Dublin Depot, Virginia. The second, made by 2,000 cavalry under Averill, was to hit the Confederate lead mines and salt works at Wytheville and Saltville. And then a third column, under Sigel's direct command, would thrust up the Shenandoah Valley, aiming to link up at some point with Crook and Averill's forces.
Crook departed first with three brigades of infantry and 2 artillery batteries. He left Gauley Bridge, West Virginia, on May 2nd. A soldier of wide experience and good reputation, Crook was admired by his men. One of his colonels, future President Rutherford B. Hayes, stated, quote, "Crook is the best soldier we have ever served under."
Averill left 3 days later. A veteran of several campaigns with the Army of the Potomac, he was perhaps best known for his victory in a minor cavalry scrap at Kelly's Ford on the Rappahannock River in March 1863. Angered by taunting messages from Fitz Lee, an old West Point classmate who led a brigade of Jeb Stuart's Confederate cavalry, Averill blew his top when Lee baited him to cross the Rappahannock, pay a visit, and bring some coffee. Well, Federal horsemen in those days had a reputation for being totally outclassed by their rebel counterparts, but nonetheless, Averill won permission to make a foray across the river.
Averill took a division across the Rappahannock, got into a stiff little fight, killed Major John Pelham, Stuart's much-beloved horse artillery commander, and left a note for his rival. "Dear Fitz, here's your coffee. Here's your visit. How do you like it?"
Well, on the one hand, the skirmish at Kelly's Ford was a symbolic turning point in the fortunes of the Federal cavalry in the Eastern Theater, and signaled that from that point on, the Union horsemen were ready, willing, and able to hold their own against their rebel counterparts. On the other hand, Kelly's Ford showed that Federal commanders still weren't up to pressing their advantage, since Averill could have won a much more substantive victory, but he grew skittish and beat a premature retreat back across the river.
In any case, here in Western Virginia in May 1864, Crook and Averill were opposed by perhaps 7,500 Confederates who were scattered across 120 miles of rugged terrain. Commanding these rebels was Major General John C. Breckinridge, a former U.S. Vice President who had become a capable Confederate general.
Breckinridge had deployed his men so as to guard every avenue by which the Yankees might approach, which meant he didn't have enough troops at any one of those points to actually repulse the enemy. He could only hope to rapidly concentrate his forces at the point of danger once the Federals' intentions became clear. Breckinridge wrote that success with such a strategy depended upon 2 things. Quote, "We must trust to the earliest intelligence of enemy movements, and then to the promptest movements."
In that spirit, the Confederates at the end of April watched the West Virginia mountains closely. They soon spotted the movement of Averill's cavalry, but did not immediately detect Crook's column, which was actually the main threat.
In fact, on May 4th, at Robert E. Lee's request, Breckinridge began shifting his 3 strongest brigades to the Shenandoah Valley to halt Sigel's advance, which Lee thought was a potential move by the Federals to pitch into his rear as he moved to confront Grant. Well, Breckinridge personally accompanied the 3 brigades and handed command of the remaining troops to Brigadier General Albert Jenkins. Jenkins was a native of Western Virginia and a former U.S. congressman who had led a brigade of Confederate cavalry during the Gettysburg campaign and been severely wounded. Jenkins was only 33 years old, but he sported an enormous, impressive beard that made him look much older.
The situation that Albert Jenkins faced quickly turned grim. With barely enough troops to contain Averill, Jenkins suddenly confronted a new threat when on May 5th, Confederate scouts spotted Crook's column as it approached Princeton, West Virginia.
The captain of the scouts sent a courier racing to find Breckinridge with the report, quote, "5 regiments are now in view, and more coming." Well, this was alarming news, since Jenkins barely had a corporal's guard to confront this new threat. Although technically Breckinridge had left him in command of 4,000 men, in reality most of them were widely scattered, and in the fast-changing situation, Jenkins wasn't even sure of their exact locations.
Jenkins knew just two things. One, a strong enemy force was approaching, and two, he had just a couple of hundred men on hand to oppose it.
Last week was our first playoff game, and my plaque psoriasis was so itchy under all my gear. Sometimes just thinking about scratching could take me out of the moment. And then my doctor told me I could get clearer skin with a pill called Otezla.
Otezla apremilast is a prescription medicine used to treat adult patients with plaque psoriasis for whom phototherapy or systemic therapy is appropriate. Otezla can help you get clearer skin after just 4 months.
Okay, ready for the next game. Talking to my doctor about a pill was a total game changer.
Don't use Otezla if you're allergic to it. Get medical help right away if you have trouble breathing or swallowing, swelling of the face, lips, tongue, throat, or arms. Severe diarrhea, nausea or vomiting, depression, suicidal thoughts, or weight loss can happen. Tell your doctor if any of these occur and if you have a history of depression or suicidal thoughts. Live in the moment. Ask your doctor about Otezla. Call 1-844-4-OTEZLA or visit Otezla.com for prescribing info about cost, and more.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever find yourself playing the budgeting game? Well, with the Name Your Price tool from Progressive, you can find options that fit your budget and potentially lower your bills. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Not available in all states.
Jenkins' tiny band held a position at the New River Narrows, a few miles inside the Virginia border. Crook's Federals entered Princeton, less than a day's march away, on May 6th. Jenkins fired off a message to Breckinridge, asking to retain one of the brigades slated to go off and confront Sigel in the Shenandoah Valley, and Breckinridge agreed.
Next day, Crook crossed Wolf Creek Mountain at Rocky Gap, a shrewd move that placed him on Jenkins' flank. Jenkins fell back from the now indefensible Narrows and headed for Dublin Depot on the railroad.
Dublin Depot was the point on the railroad closest to Crook, and therefore the logical place for Jenkins to make a stand. As a bonus, the brigade he'd requested to retain under his command was already there, led by Colonel John McCausland. McCausland and his men had been awaiting transportation to the Shenandoah Valley, but were told to stand by, and were now available to Jenkins.
The evening of May 8th found Crook's Federals at Poplar Hill, just 8 miles from Dublin. Their total effective strength was about 6,500 men. Jenkins, with about one-third that number, edged forward into the shadow of Cloyd's Mountain, a 2,600-foot ridge dividing the opposing forces. Jenkins posted his troops on a high knoll facing the gap through which the Yankees must advance. There he waited for morning and battle.
Crook's Federals broke camp at 5 o'clock on the morning of May 9th and began the long ascent up Cloyd's Mountain. Near the summit, the Yankees ran into a handful of rebel skirmishers, chased them away, and continued to the top. Just off to the east, there was a spot that offered a better view, so Crook, his staff, and Colonel Carr White, his lead brigade commander, made their way over to it to see what they could see.
The effort paid off, as in the valley below, some 2 miles away, they could see the Confederates' whole position. Rebel infantry had thrown up fence rail breastworks, and the barrels of 9 rebel artillery pieces gleamed in the morning sun.
As the Federals watched, a new body of Confederate infantry arrived and formed up behind their already deployed comrades. Crook took in the scene through field glasses, then handed them to White and declared, "The enemy is in force and in a strong position. They may whip us, but I guess not."
As Jenkins, now up to 3,000 men thanks to those last-minute reinforcements, made his final preparations across the way, Crooks deployed his 3 brigades for battle.
2 of the Federal brigades would approach the Confederate position head-on, while the 3rd, White's, made a wide flanking movement around the rebel right, crossing the mountain through dense woods until finally arriving on Shuffle Ridge, on whose western crest stood the Confederate defensive works.
White deployed his brigade with 2 regiments up front and 2 back, and then advanced through a thick belt of trees toward the enemy. After a half-mile or so, his men started to come under heavy fire, but they far outnumbered the rebels to their front and soon put them under heavy pressure.
Jenkins sent a small battalion to shore up that threatened flank, but it wasn't enough. He then sent one of his largest regiments over from his left, and at that moment the other 2 Federal brigades attacked the Confederate position frontally. Crook led that assault personally, charging across a wide meadow. Colonel Horatio Sickle commanded the brigade on the right, while Rutherford B. Hayes led the one on the left. Rebel musket and cannon fire swept the meadow, and dozens of Federals fell, but the rest closed ranks and kept moving resolutely forward.
The Federals were barely 100 yards from the rebel lines when they ran smack into Back Creek. The presence of the stream came as a complete surprise to Crook. It cut a gully 4 feet deep and was wide enough to constitute a significant barrier. The Federals tumbled down its banks into the water and promptly lost all semblance of an organized line of battle.
Fortunately, the creek bed was deep enough to offer some measure of cover against the rebel fire, while officers and sergeants restored order. Otherwise, the attack by the 2 brigades would have fallen apart right there. As it was, after several minutes spent getting themselves sorted out, the Federal soldiers shook the water from their shoes and resumed their charge.
The Yankees proved unstoppable. Crook's men reached the rebel breastworks, fought the defenders hand to hand for a few frantic moments, but quickly overwhelmed them through sheer weight of numbers. Albert Jenkins struggled to rally his troops, but was shot in the arm and captured.
John McCausland then took command and unsuccessfully tried to form a new defensive line, but the Federals' momentum was irresistible, and the Confederates began to retreat. It was an orderly withdrawal at first, but then, thanks to pressure by Crook's small force of 400 Union cavalry, it was every man for himself as the Confederates skedaddled as fast as their legs could carry them, until by the time they reached Dublin Depot, it was a complete rout. Only the timely arrival of a fresh rebel regiment, the 5th Kentucky, prevented a wholesale disaster.
Led by Colonel Howard Smith, the Kentuckians had boarded a train at Saltville the previous evening. Originally about 750 strong, almost half of them had to be left behind when their locomotive derailed. Now, scarcely 400 were on hand to confront the victorious Yankees.
Smith took stock of the situation, formed up his regiment, and marched off up the road. He soon found McCausland and asked for orders. McCausland told him to resist the enemy's advance and cover the retreat. And so, for more than an hour, Smith and his Kentuckians did exactly that, fending off the Yankee horsemen and then an assault by Hayes' brigade. The Kentuckians held on long enough to allow McCausland and everyone else to make a clean escape, then they followed. The Confederates crossed the New River and bivouacked for the night. Crook's Federals entered Dublin at dusk, bone-weary but delighted with their victory.
Victory had come at a cost. Over 100 Federals had been killed and a little more than 500 wounded. An additional 72 were listed as missing. Confederate losses are estimated to have been around 70 killed, 260 wounded, and 200 missing.
The next morning, May 10th, the Federals burned the Dublin Telegraph Office, the railroad station, and a large Confederate supply depot. Then they marched a few miles east to the 400-foot-long wooden New River Bridge. To protect it, McCausland had deployed rebel sharpshooters and some artillery pieces on the opposite shore.
Crook promptly brought up his own guns, and an artillery duel ensued. For 2 hours, the Union and rebel gunners traded shots, and the exchange only sputtered to a halt when the Confederates began to run low on ammunition.
Finally, a detachment of Federals from Sickles' brigade went forward and successfully set fire to the bridge. The span's destruction removed the Confederates' sole reason for lingering, and so McCausland ordered a general retreat to Christiansburg, 12 miles to the east.
The Federals made no attempt to pursue the retreating rebels. Instead, George Crook decided to pack it up and head back to West Virginia. Except for a handful of rebel horsemen who were easily shoved aside, Crook's column encountered no opposition on its return march except heavy rains that turned the mountain roads into gelatinous muck.
On May 14th, Crook reached Union just across the West Virginia border. The next day, Averill's cavalrymen rode into town, and Crook for the first time learned how the Federal horsemen had fared. As you might guess, that tale was not inspiring. But we'll wait until next week to get into that story. And with the next episode, we'll also turn our attention to Franz Sigel and see what happened with him over in the Shenandoah Valley.
That means it's time for this episode's book recommendation, and our recommendation this time is Rutherford B. Hayes, Warrior and President by R.E. Hugenboom.
We've mentioned Rutherford B. Hayes a few times on the podcast, and this biography goes into quite a bit of detail about Hayes' service during the Civil War, as well as offering a sympathetic view of Hayes' presidency and the end of Reconstruction. It's a bit revisionist, but still a good read.
Don't forget you can find a list of all of our book recommendations if you head over to the podcast website, which is www.civilwarpodcast.org.
Also at the website, you can find info about joining the Strawfoot Brigade over on Patreon and supporting the podcast in that way, just like Daryl K., Mark A., Dr. Rick, and Mike K. have all done recently.
Thanks, guys.
And thanks to all of you for listening to this episode of the podcast. Tracy and I do hope that you join us again next time, but until then, take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.